Everything is made up of atoms, and the composition, the ratios of the different isotopes, reflects the ratios of the source that made up the material. Take a tree. A tree is breathing carbon dioxide in from the atmosphere, and it's taking in carbon-12, O2, carbon-13, O2, and carbon-14, O2 in the ratio that it finds it in the atmosphere. And so we can go back through long periods of time before we even knew atoms existed and measure the composition of the Earth's atmosphere in terms of these carbon isotopes by looking at the material that was produced at that time. We can take trees that are hundreds of years old, sample the ring from, say, 500 years ago, and measure the carbon-13 to carbon-12 and carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratios. We can take coral reefs, we can take the shells of little plankton. There are many signatures that come from taking carbon out of the air and incorporating it into some living matter that gives us a record, a historical record of the ratios of carbon isotopes in the atmosphere at the time. If we do this for carbon-13, we see a plot that looks like this, that over the last 750 years or so, the amount of carbon-13 to carbon-12 was very constant for a long period of time until around 1800. What happened in 1800? The Industrial Revolution. In the late 1700s, we started mining and burning lots of coal. In the 1820s, we started burning natural gas. In the 1860s, we discovered oil and started burning that. We were burning all this carbon stored up from these ancient plants in coal, oil, and natural gas, and burning is combining with oxygen, so carbon plus O2 is CO2. And what we see in the graph is that the carbon-13 to carbon-12 ratio in the atmosphere started to decline. And it's declined faster and faster and faster as we come to the present day. An interesting clue. And here you see just the last 40 years, it continues down in this annual fluctuation, as we saw in the CO2 being added and subtracted from the atmosphere, but a steady downhill slope. So you can see as on the bottom, the carbon dioxide is rising in the atmosphere, the C13 to C12 ratio is declining. And they both have this annual cycle. And the annual cycle is stunningly, beautifully anti-correlated. See this diagram here on the top, we have the CO2 coming out of the atmosphere. So remember, the trees are breathing it in from May to June to July to August, September, October. Then the leaves fall off the trees, they start to rot, and the little bacteria release CO2 back to the atmosphere in November, December, January, February, March, April, May, and we have this annual cycle of CO2 in the atmosphere. Look on the bottom of the plot, and you see the C13 to C12 ratio in the air does exactly the opposite. As the carbon dioxide is drawn out of the air during the growing season, the C13 to C12 ratio rises. As the CO2 is released back to the atmosphere in the dead season, then the C13 to C12 ratio falls. Why should this be? Well, it turns out plants discriminate against carbon-13. The only difference between carbon-12 and carbon-13 and carbon-14 is the number of neutrons, and therefore in their masses. And the more massive molecules with C13 and C14 move more slowly than the C12. Now the tree has this short little growing season. It wants to get as much carbon in there as possible. And so what it does is preferentially suck the speedier carbon-12 O2 molecules out of the atmosphere and leave the C13 in the atmosphere. So during the growing season, CO2 is sucked out of the atmosphere, but C13 is left behind and its concentration rises. In the opposite season, when the CO2 is being released back into the atmosphere, that CO2 is deficient in C13, and so the C13 to C12 ratio falls instead. What about C14? Well, C14 is special in that it's a radioactive nucleus. That means it spontaneously falls apart, transforming itself from carbon into a different element, nitrogen, which makes up most of our atmosphere, by spitting out an electron and a funny little particle called an antineutrino, which we needn't worry about. If we look at the C14 ratio as a function of time, because of this decay, it naturally leaves the environment. And the time it takes to do this is 5,730 years. So if I start with 100 atoms of carbon-14, in 5,730 years, I'll have 50 of them left. In another 5,730 years, I'll have 25 of them left. In yet another 5,730 years, I'll have 12 of them left. So it naturally decays with time, and over tens of thousands of years disappears from the environment. You might well ask, well, then how can there be any carbon-14 left from the formation of the Earth? And the answer is there isn't. Carbon-14 is produced all the time high in our atmosphere by the collisions of super high-energy particles from the universe that collide with our atmosphere and produce carbon-14. So there's a steady supply. What we see when we look at the plants or the seashells or the coral reefs is that the carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio is also declining fairly rapidly with time, much more rapidly than this 5,700 year decay rate. Here you see the data over just a decade, and you can see the carbon-14 is falling rapidly. So what does all this say about the source of the rapidly rising CO2 content of Earth's atmosphere? Well, we have to look to the source of different possible origins for the CO2. Let's start with volcanoes. Volcanoes spew, when they erupt, carbon dioxide along with water vapor, ash, and rocks and other things into the atmosphere. But it turns out that the CO2 that the volcano puts into the atmosphere has a high ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12. That is, it adds extra carbon-13 to the atmosphere, increasing the ratio of C13 to C12. There's also a lot of carbon dioxide dissolved in the ocean. You know carbon dioxide dissolves in water because when you shake your can of Coke and open it up, it spews out the top. That's the carbon dioxide escaping. Now, the carbon dioxide going into the ocean and the carbon dioxide coming out of the ocean is sort of neutral with regard to the C13 to C12 ratio. And finally, there's plants, as I suggested, in their growing season, discriminate against carbon-13 to carbon-12. And so that gives a lower source of carbon-13 to carbon-12 when they rot. What about carbon-14 to carbon-12? Well, it turns out, in addition to the natural source of carbon-14, in the 1950s and the 1960s, we spent a lot of time doing something not very helpful, but blowing up nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, and that produced a huge amount of carbon-14. In plants, over an annual cycle, they will discriminate against carbon-14, just like they discriminate against carbon-13, and leave it in the atmosphere when they're growing, but therefore, when they rot, they put back extra carbon-12, and so it's a wash. However, ancient plants that were growing 100, 200, 300 million years ago, when our current beds of coal and our wells of oil and natural gas were laid down, those plants also discriminated against carbon-13 and carbon-14, but in those cases, since they're hundreds of millions of years old, 100% of the carbon-14 has decayed. So there's zero carbon-14 to carbon-12 in fossil fuels. The picture looks like this. We have an atmosphere. It's full of C12, C13, and C14. Most of the atoms are C12, those are the green dots. A few of them are C13, 1% or so, those are the white dots. And occasionally, there's a C14. And what we're going to do is add some gas to the atmosphere. We know that's happening. And see what the carbon isotopes look like. If the gas that's being added to the atmosphere to increase the CO2 abundance comes primarily from volcanoes, then we'd expect that to have extra C13, extra little white dots compared to the number of green dots, and a little bit of C14. And so the C13 to C12 ratio would go up with time, the opposite of what we observe, and the C14 to C12 ratio stays the same, also not what we observe. If it were just current plants, say from forest fires or something, then we know we'd be adding less C13 to the atmosphere because that's discriminated against in plants, and pretty rare C14 as well. So the C13 to C12 ratio would fall, but the C14 to C12 ratio would remain very, very small. Alternatively, if we talk about ancient plants, which have less C13 because they're plants, and no C14 because it's all decayed away, then that predicts the C13 to C12 ratio should fall, and the C14 to C12 ratio should also fall precisely as observed. Therefore, one can conclude that it is a fact that the Earth's atmospheric carbon dioxide content is increasing at about 0.6% per year with time, and nearly all of it is a consequence of burning fossil fuels.